Welcome to another episode of the Confessions of a Recovering Landlord podcast, where you'll learn the secrets commercial landlords would prefer you not know. I'm your host, Jan Gibbons, along with my co-host and experienced commercial real estate broker, Bob Gibbons.
That's me.
Brought to you by Rata Commercial Realty, where we exclusively represent users of office and warehouse properties. Landlords have representation. Do you? Hello, and welcome back to Confessions of a Recovering Landlord. We thought today we would help provide a structure. A lot of terms, a lot of acronyms are used in contract language, especially in commercial real estate, which we like to call CRE, because we're old and we got to get things done fast. So today I thought we would throw out some glossary terms. Bob will give a definition, but the best part, we're going to give an example of each of these and where people might have gone astray and we could have helped them.
Oh.
So let's start out with amortization of TIs. First of all, you got to do TIs.
Well, and you got to define TIs and amortization. That's for that matter.
What I just said.
So
what are TIs?
So TIs is an acronym, of course, for tenant improvements. So that's really just whenever you lease a building or buy a building, either one, and it's the interior construction, the tenant improvements, the improvements that are required for that individual tenant to use the building in a way that makes sense. If the building's built the first time and it's just, 4 walls and a roof, obviously you got to do something on the interior to make it usable to them. If that tenant moves out and 10 years later you're leasing it to someone else, well, they might want to change some things. So TIs could be as little as paint the walls, shampoo the carpets, replace the carpet, move a few walls, or it could be just like demo the whole thing and start all over. So it's, any of the above could be considered TIs.
So then what is the amortization of those TIs?
Well, so usually when you sign a lease, there's an agreement between the tenant and the landlord as to what improvements are going to be allowed in the space and who's going to pay for those improvements. So the TIs, and there's something we call a TI allowance, tenant improvement allowance. And that usually refers to an amount of money that the landlord is going to pay for improvements for the tenant's benefit. So if we sign a lease that says the landlord's going to give us $20 a foot per square foot of space being leased toward those improvements, then the landlord will pay up to that amount. So if it only comes up to $18 a square foot, well, the landlord saved $2 a square foot. If it comes out to $25 a foot, on the other hand, well, now somebody's going to have to pay the $5 a foot. And that somebody, of course, is the tenant. So the landlord pays the first $20 a square foot, the tenant pays the next $5. Well, sometimes the tenant doesn't want to have to pay for that out of their pocket. And so they have to figure out how to finance that. They could go to a bank and say, hey, bank, give me $5 a square foot. I'm leasing, 50,000 square feet. I need $250,000 for these excess tenant improvements, and I want a loan on that. So the bank says, great, that'll be a 9.75% interest rate. Wow, that's more than I want to pay. Hey, Mr. Landlord, would you amortize these into my rental rate? Well, all that really means is you're calculating it as if it's a loan at some interest rate over the term of the lease. So if you have a 5-year lease, you just take that $250,000 as your principal payment, your interest rate, whatever that is, 7, 8, 9%, over the number of years or the number of payments. Let's say it's a 5-year lease, so it's 60 payments. Mm-hmm. And that's just an additional amount you pay. And it could be a separate number that shows up on your statement from your landlord, or it could be, hey, now instead of paying $35 a square foot, now I'm paying $38 a square foot. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. But ultimately, when you say we're amortizing the TIs into the deal, that means that the landlord is going to fund some excess TIs over the amount agreed to in the deal. And it's really a form of the landlord loaning you the money. And the only reason a tenant really does that is, one, if the landlord's going to give them a better interest rate than they could get otherwise, or they just don't want to mess with going to another source like a bank to fund those things.
Go back just for a minute. You were talking about if the landlord allowed a $20 per square foot TI allowance and the tenant only used 18 of it. You have negotiated something to be done with that in other leases. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, I mean, the way we look at it, since we represent the user, the tenant, is if we negotiate for $20 a square foot for improvements, that's the tenant's money. And so if they don't use that money, we want the option to use it for something else. So we might want to say, well, we want to be able to apply that $2 a square foot toward the tenant's cost of their cabling, like for their telephones and internet cabling,
parking,
for their moving costs, or it could be for rental costs, like base rent, operating expenses, parking, those kinds of things. Landlords hate that. I mean, they hate having.
But you've gotten it.
They hate anything when it's not in their favor, of course. But we all do,
don't we all?
but yeah, we will get that ability. In fact, we had a tenant client just yesterday send a notice to a landlord saying, "Hey, I know we have until March of 2024 to spend this money, but we're not going to spend the money at all. So just go ahead and give it to us as a rental credit because we had negotiated that." So, and actually that brings up the other point is make sure that you negotiate for a period of time to spend the money if you're doing an allowance. If you do what's called a turnkey, where you're just saying, "Hey, landlord, you build it out and deliver it to me in this condition. We don't care how much it costs. We're just saying deliver it in that condition." But if it's an allowance, now it's the tenant's money. And in that case, if we don't spend it all, then we want to have the ability to do something with it. As always, the size of the tenant, the relative balance of power between landlord and tenant is what determines whether or not we can get that. In a strong landlord market, you're probably not going to get that unless you have a really big tenant.
So it's Coca-Cola versus Aunt Bee's cherry pies. Okay, the next one is something I think is going away, but I'm going to couple it with some other things. Base share, triple nets, and pro rata share. Just put all those together.
Well, all of that is under the umbrella of the common operating expenses of the building that the landlord charges to the tenants.
Passes through.
So it's not supposed to be a profit center for the landlord. They're just like, "Hey, it cost me $1 million to operate the building and you occupy 10% of the building. Therefore you pay your 10%. So it's $100,000. Here's your bill." And they usually, collect 1/12 of that throughout the year, every month. And then at the end of the year, they reconcile that. So if the actual expenses came out to be $950,000, all right, well, they'll give you back your savings. But most of the time it seems like we were a little less, so it actually turned out to be more. And so here's your bill for the additional amount. So there's a variety of ways in which they can handle that. For office buildings in the past, there has been sort of a rental rate structure called a full service lease. And the full service lease usually comes with a base year for expenses, which just says that whatever the expenses are in that base year, let's say we sign a lease in 2023. So we're going to say that the base year for whatever the expenses are in the base year. So at the end of 23, after they've reconciled the numbers, now we'll know what the base year expenses were. And let's say those were $14. And then in 2024, they turn out to be $14.75. Well, the tenant is still paying their base rent, $35 a foot, let's say, but then they're also paying the extra 75 cents a square foot, which is what the expenses, they exceeded the base year. So they pay that extra amount. If it's a triple net lease, on the other hand, well, now the base rent does not include any common operating expenses, and the tenant pays for those separately. So
and more leases are going to that format.
For office buildings, that's true. For industrial buildings, it's almost always been that way. Now, some industrial buildings, particularly the flex buildings, have had what they call an industrial gross structure, which is very similar to what I just described for full service, where there's a base year for the common operating expenses. But when you're in a triple net situation, you basically just now have two buckets. You have your base rent and you have your operating expenses. and your share of operating expenses, and whatever they are in that year is the amount you pay, and that's pretty much it. So the advantage of the triple net is that it more accurately shows what is actually being paid for. It also allows companies that are using generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP accounting, they now have to capitalize their leases on their balance sheet, but they don't have to do that for the expenses. So if you already have your lease structured as a triple net, it's easier to kind of say, all right, this is the amount for each of those things, because the operating expenses are a true expense on the P&L for a company, whereas the lease is a balance sheet issue and a P&L issue for the current year portion. So it makes it easier for that. The other advantage to the tenant is that, let's say, like in industrial leases right now, because inflation is higher, the landlords are charging much higher annual bumps. So instead of a 2 or 3% annual bump in your operating in your expenses, in your base rent, they now want 4 or 5, 6%. And so it's better to put a 5% increase every year on a $9 rental rate than a $14 rental rate, because that just keeps compounding. And so the lower the base rent, the better when you have that kind of thing. So it can save the tenants a bit of money in that situation. Was there a third part of that I'm forgetting?
Oh, well, the pro rata share, I think you kind of described it, but there is a formula if you want to give it for the nerds listening.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the tenant square footage, but divided by the total of the building. The one thing that is interesting about that is that a lot of leases don't state what the rental rate, what the square footage is of the building. Some don't even show you what the rental rate of I keep saying that. Many of them don't even show the square footage of the space being leased, which is absurd. I was with a company once that tried that for a while, and man, oh man, was that a nightmare. In that case, you just have to state what the pro rata share is, which is just the tenant's portion of the building, 10%, 12.259, whatever. And so that needs to be stated, or the formula for it needs to be stated. The thing that's interesting is that sometimes landlords will remeasure a building, and then both the numerator and denominator of that equation may change, and that may change your pro rata share somewhat. The other thing is that in certain kinds of buildings, a landlord may have the ability they may have a different way of recovering expenses from one tenant versus another. So if in one case, let's say there's a project that has multiple buildings in it, and they lease an entire building to one tenant, and they say, all right, tenant, you're going to pay your own operating expenses, you're going to pay your own property taxes, but you still have to share in the cost of the security for the campus, for the property management of the campus, et cetera. Well, now your pro rata share for certain expenses is different than it is for other expenses. And so again, that should be stated in the lease, but even in that case, in all the other leases in the project, then that affects all those other tenants too, because now you're removing certain expenses from the bucket of common expenses. And so you think it's just for that one tenant, but it actually affects everybody.
Okay. Commencement date. It seems so simple.
If it only was.
Yep.
Well, there's a lot of dates in the lease. There's the effective date, which is the date you sign the lease.
All parties sign the lease.
Fully execute.
Right.
Although I have seen many leases where the effective date is March 1st, but guess when they signed it? May 15. It's basically just a date that you say that the lease became effective. That's when all the parties are obligated under the terms of the lease. So that's the effective date. Then you may have a delivery date, which is basically the date that the landlord turned the keys over to you as the tenant to do whatever. And then you might have a period of time in which you're allowed to do construction for improvements, if you as the tenant are responsible for the improvements. And so in that situation, let's say March 1st is the effective date, and then you're given the keys on March 15. They give you a month and a half to do improvements. So now you go through the rest of March and all of April, and you're now going to commence the lease on May 1st. Well, the commencement of the lease in that situation really has nothing to do with when the improvements are made or when the tenant moves in. It's just a defined date for commencement. I don't really like that such scenario because it puts the tenant in the position of having to manage the construction process, and they're probably not experts at construction, and they have a business to run, and that's just a big distraction to them. So I prefer for the landlord to handle it if we can, which in most office buildings you can get that, and in a lot of the industrial you can as well. So I prefer that for the landlord to handle it, even if it's an allowance situation or a defined scope, turnkey situation. I still like the landlord to be responsible for it, because if they don't finish it on time, all right, now the commencement date's not May 1st. It slides to whatever the date is that it actually is finished, and the tenant can take occupancy of the space. So the commencement date can be a bit of a sticky wicket. We have a client right now that is in signed a lease in a building where the building had some catastrophic damage over the winter, and the landlord was fixing it. And we signed a lease that said, yeah, we'll go ahead and sign this lease, and we'll anticipate a commencement date. But if you don't get it done and the space is available for commencement and for occupancy by September 1st, now the tenant has the option to terminate the lease. And guess what? It is, what is it? The 11th August 11th, and they haven't even started construction. Now they don't have a ton of stuff to do, but they have enough that they can't get it done by September 1st. So we're having some discussions right now of how we're going to deal with that. So commencement date sounds like a simple issue, but it can be very complicated whenever you get construction, or what if the tenant that's in the space right now doesn't get out of the way in time? Whose problem is that? Mm-hmm. So it really needs to be something that's thought through very, very carefully.
And the biggest thing to me of commencement date is that's the date your rent begins.
Your rent schedule begins. True.
Right. You've paid a deposit and possibly first month, whatever was agreed to in the lease, but that's when your monthly rental payments start, unless of course you've negotiated free rent. But even so, that's built into the rent schedule.
Right. And,
okay.
And because you said that, I'm sorry, it reminds me of one other thing. Sometimes we have people that'll say, hey, what do you care about the commencement date? You have free rent anyway. Well,
you're burning my free rent while I'm not in there.
Exactly.
You gave me something that you didn't give me.
Exactly. So if you negotiate for free rent, I want free rent. That is,
and I'm working in there.
Right. That's when I'm occupying those spaces as a tenant. So if the tenant's going to handle the construction, I want to know when the landlord's going to deliver the space to us, and then everything keys off of that. If we get 4 months for construction, it's 4 months from delivery, and then the commencement date starts. And then if we have free rent, that's when the free rent starts. Right. So there's a big difference between construction time and free rent time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. My favorite word to say, Estoppel.
I think I wrote a blog one time that was like, Estoppel, do I need a cream for that?
Yes, I remember that. We're so mature.
Oh, it's funny. I was actually I had lunch with a banker today, and we were talking about estoppels. Estoppels sound scary to some people, but in the simplest terms, an estoppel is really nothing more than a buyer of a building or a lender of a building saying to a tenant, hey, the landlord told us this about your lease. Is it true? So it's really just the tenant's acknowledgement that what the landlord told the buyer or the lender is in fact true. And
how often do you find that it's not?
Well, they're almost always true-ish. But I
almost always find something wrong with them. Almost always. Now, it may not be material, but anal me says, that's wrong.
I usually say 30 to 40% have a material difference or problem with them. They forgot to put in the renewal option, or they failed to mention that there's still outstanding tenant improvements allowances to be spent, or
they have the rent schedule wrong,
or they put in the wrong, or they didn't make reference. The last one we saw they put in the date of the lease for the first amendment, which was an extension of the lease, but they didn't reference the original lease. And so
they showed rent effective October, which was a higher rate than he's paying right now. So I felt like the landlord was disingenuous, showing, oh, this is my rent roll, and really this is my rent roll. So,
well, the interesting
way to keep him honest.
It's absolutely a way to keep him honest. But the first thing I would say is the landlord who's either selling or refinancing the building should never be the one to create the estoppels. That's a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
So they should let the lender or the buyer create the estoppels and send it to the tenants, because it's basically saying, hey, the landlord told me this. So if the landlord's creating it, that's not right. Now, I guess the landlord could create it and give it to the lender or the buyer to verify before it goes to the tenants. But, it really shouldn't be created by the landlord, in my view. The other thing is, whenever in practice, let's say you have a building that's, a giant building, and you have, 5 really large tenants, and then you've got like 40 little tiny tenants. A lot of times in the contract, when you're buying a building, it'll say, I must have an estoppel from every tenant above a certain square footage. And I've got to get 80% of those from the smaller guys. So it avoids any one tenant from sort of holding the deal hostage. But most leases actually say that the tenant is required to sign the estoppel within a certain period of time, or it constitutes a default, or they nominated the landlord to be their attorney in fact to sign on their behalf if they don't.
Love it.
Yeah.
Kind of reminded me of Congress.
So anyway, estoppel is nothing to be afraid of. But the one thing I will say is that it is a legally binding document. And let's just play out the scenario. The buyer of a building sends you an estoppel and there's an error on it. It has the wrong rent schedule. It shows that you're going to be paying $100,000 a year in rent, when in fact you're only paying $90,000 a year in rent. All right, now what happens? You have a lease that says 90, but you have an estoppel that says 100. That buyer of the building has relied on your representation that it's 100. Now what? Bring in the attorneys. So that's why this is
WWE SmackDown.
That's why this is important. So we always tell tenants, let us review it before you do, and let us make sure that we think it's looks normal. And the other thing the estoppel says is that nobody's in default on the lease, not the tenant, not the landlord. So if you have a beef with your landlord about something, you might better write it down on that estoppel so that it can put people on notice. We had one of these 2 or 3 years ago where we were having a big beef with the landlord. Not only the tenant was, but we as the agents were too, because he hadn't paid us our commission either. And so we just wrote a whole bunch of notes on that estoppel, which we just do in handwriting. You just write in whatever you think is the changes and initial each one and sign the thing and send it back to the lender or the buyer. And boy, that gets some action in a hurry.
Yeah, especially when there's already a close date. Okay, guarantee.
Well, a guarantee kind of comes under the whole credit category. And in the simplest term, a guarantee is just something that some person or entity tells the landlord, I will pay the rent and handle all the obligations of the lease if the primary tenant can't. So we see this most commonly when there's a company that's a startup, or it hasn't really ramped up to the point where it has sufficient history that a landlord's willing to sign the lease, pay the money for improvements, pay the commissions, because they have a big investment in this, so they want to know they're going to get paid. Just like if you go out and take out a loan from a bank, the bank's going to want to know they're going to get paid. So they might say that the landlord might say, well, I need a personal guarantee from the owner of the business, or from several owners of the business, or from some third party person who isn't even an owner of the business. We had a client many years ago that, he was actually the manager of that branch, and the owner of the business was trying to sell that branch to this guy, but this guy just didn't have any significant money to be the guarantor. And so the landlord said, look, we'd love to have you in the building, but you gotta you got to give us a guarantor who actually has some substantial backing, some real balance sheet power, net worth. And so he actually went to one of his customers and who had a substantial balance sheet and said, would you be willing to be my guarantor? And I will give you a piece of the business for that. And
Wow.
and it worked like a charm, and it's been very successful, and so good for them.
Okay,
So
quick question. Oh, go ahead.
go ahead. Sorry.
If I go to the bank and I say, I'm buying me a new car, I need this much money, they say, here you go, take the money. But that car is my collateral. I mean, they are underwriting me. Obviously, are you employed? You got a paycheck coming. They do underwrite the loan, but they have collateral. Why isn't that lease collateral? For the landlord to expect the tenant to underwrite all of their liability is too much to me, because if you don't pay the rent, I'm kicking you out and I'm releasing your space.
Right. And that's what you would call mitigation of damages. So if you
Or
have a lease,
collateral. It's basically collateral.
well, and
It's
sort
not
of,
as good as taking the car and selling it, but
yeah, in a roundabout way, that's true. But, if somebody defaults on their car loan or their building loan or their whatever loan, you can repossess it or foreclose on it and then go sell it to somebody else. How much are you going to get for that? I don't know. Well, same thing with a lease. If the tenant doesn't pay the rent and the landlord has to lock out the tenant and exercise their remedy of terminating the lease, how long is it going to take for them to find another tenant? How much is it going to cost them to do more improvements on the space, to pay a commission, and at what rental rate is it going to be? So those are all unknowns. But yes, the language in most leases does require, at least in the state of Texas, does require the landlord to mitigate damages. They can't let that space sit vacant for the next 8 years with no attempt to try and lease it. They have to make a concerted effort to lease it, and that then reduces the liability of the tenant or the guarantor. But anyway, so guarantees are a real thing. We have a deal right now we're trying to do where the landlord, in my opinion, is just being obscenely ridiculous, because
well,
this
he
is
asked for their firstborn. I didn't think that was over the top.
It's so frustrating because I've been a landlord for 20 years. I get it. You want to make sure that the tenant you're leasing to has a strong ability, a high likelihood that they're going to pay the rent. So I don't have any problem with that. But these people want absolutely no risk at all. And I'm like, well, no, you bought a building and you are a landlord, you signed up for this gig. So, for you now to try and,
how'd that work for you?
well, and what's funny to me is that they're so afraid of leasing the building to somebody who doesn't have perfect credit and eliminates all their risk, that they haven't leased it. It's been sitting vacant for 3 years. And now they have done a renovation, a major renovation that really looks great. I mean, it's a perfect building for our client, but it's now been sitting vacant for about 1.5 years since they finished that renovation. So they think they're being so smart, waiting for the perfect thing, perfect tenant that's never going to go under and never going to leave them without rent. And yet they're foregoing all this rent on the front end. So they're, what is that saying? Cutting off your nose to spite your face or whatever. It doesn't make sense. And no matter what I say, the landlord just doesn't seem to understand it. And they actually have a fairly substantial portfolio of buildings. So, maybe they know something I don't, but I just don't get it.
Okay. Now for something really exciting. Parking ratio.
Oh, well, parking ratio is really the number of parking spaces you get relative to the size of the space you lease. So if you have a parking ratio of 3 per 1,000 square feet, you have 3,000 square feet. So you just take 3,000 square feet divided by 1,000 times 3. So you get 9 parking spaces. If you have a 5 per 1,000 ratio, you get 15. So
are those ratios demanded by the city or ordinance or usage, or does any of that come into play?
It's a combination of two things. Zoning usually will dictate a required ratio for different property types. So in our area of North Texas, it's usually 3 parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet of office space, 4 per 1,000 for retail, or no, I'm sorry, 4 per 1,000 for medical, 5 per 1,000 for retail. And then when you get into some other categories, like restaurants could be 10 per 1,000. Or if you go into what's called an assembly use, which would be like a church or a training center, it may be you have to have 1 parking space for every 2 or 2.5 seats in the auditorium. So it depends on the use. And yeah, the city is going to have a big say in that. The other person that has a big say in it is going to be the landlord, of course, because it's based on how many are available. So even though only 3 per 1,000 may be required by zoning, the landlord may say, for competitive reasons, I'm going to build 5 or 6 per 1,000 because I want to be able to appeal to a company that wants to pack them in. Like if it's a call center, we have a client that's a call center. The property actually only has 5 per 1,000 parking. They gave our client an over allocation of 6 per 1,000. And they said, by the way, if you really need 7 per 1,000, we can do that, but it's going to cost you because we're going to have to build on an adjacent lot. Yeah, we do have those kinds of situations come in. So parking ratio is a big issue. We see this a lot also in industrial, where you see these industrial buildings, big warehouses that'll have a recreational use, like a gymnastics studio or a volleyball use or a batting cages. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are going into those things. And the problem with that is that, an industrial building may only have 1 or 1.5 or 2 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. And if you have, an indoor recreational use that puts a lot of people in there, it can't handle it. And then the people that come to work out there or to play the sports or to do whatever the activity is, they don't pay attention to where they're limited to park, and they park all over the place. And it really creates a lot of problems with the adjacent tenants, homeowners, everything. So a lot of cities have gotten wise to the indoor recreational uses in warehouses, and many of them won't allow it anymore, or they won't allow it unless there's sufficient parking on the same property.
Yeah. Okay. Holding over.
Holding over what?
I'm holding it over your head. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, holding over is just, the lease expires, right? You have a date in the lease that says this is when your lease expires. Well, everybody knows that. Usually the day they sign the lease, or at least the date that the lease commences, they'll say it's a 60-month lease after the commencement date. So you think it's going to be March 15 is going to be your commencement date. It actually turns out to be April 15th. So commencement date is going to be April 15th, and then your expiration date is going to be April 14th, 5 years later, or more than likely April 30th, because usually you round it off to the end of whatever month that the commencement date would otherwise have expired in. So that date, usually 3, 5, 10 years ahead of time. So, it should be pretty easy to plan for getting out by that time, right? Or negotiating an extension by that time. But you can't believe how often that doesn't happen. And that's when holdover kicks in. So the holdover clause in a lease simply says, if you don't move out of the building when required, and we don't have an agreement signed to the contrary, your rent now is going to go up to some amount. And usually it's a formula. Usually it's some percentage of what you've been paying. So usually it's going to be 150%, 1.5 times what you've been paying, 2 times. I've even seen it 3 times. And it's intended to be purposely painful.
Penurious.
Say that again.
Penurious.
I have not heard that word in forever.
Well, I got a good glossary term in then.
Yeah, I mean, it's intended to be penurious. I don't even know if I said that right. They want it to hurt. They want it painful. To hurt because they want to motivate you to get a decision made, either move out so I can lease it to someone else or sign it with us. And so why do people end up in holdover? Well, there's a lot of reasons. One, they didn't start soon enough and trying to figure out what they're going to do next. 2, they're building a new building that they're going to move to, or they're finishing out the interior of a building that they're going to move to, and it's taking longer than planned. They had to wait on financing. They had a partner that drug their feet and didn't do it in time. They're waiting on a customer to tell them they were going to get the contract before they pulled the trigger on moving to that new location or to expand. I mean, there's a million reasons why it could happen, but the bottom line is that date's coming and you have to pay the piper if you don't get out of the way.
Talk about when we can get it waived.
Well, I mean, so if we have a tenant that's still negotiating with the landlord, we will go to that landlord and say, hey, we're still negotiating with you. Please put off the holdover rent kicking in for another 3 months, 6 months, whatever. A smart landlord's going to say, no, you pay the holdover fee. And if you end up signing a lease with us in the next 90 days, then we will credit back to you the excess amount that you paid. But we're not going to just give you a blank check to say you don't have to pay anything more and just give you more time to go find another place to move. So when I was a landlord, that's the way I did it. So that's what I expect landlords to do. It's surprising to me how often they will say, oh yeah, no problem.
No, right. Well, they want to keep a tenant. If it's a good tenant, it's easier to keep them than to go out and get it ready and start the showing all over again.
A lot of it depends on what the reason we're giving them is, et cetera. I tell clients, look, if we'll give the landlord a defined time, so we're not just saying we're going to continue in holdover, which means either party can terminate with 30 days notice or whatever the terms of your lease says. But instead, we're going to say, look, we need 6 months. All right, now I think we have a better shot at getting the same rental rate or whatever the current market rental rate is for that space, for that holdover period, than if we just say, it's a nebulous, whenever I'm done with it. Yeah. That's harder for a landlord to deal with because they don't know when they can tell a prospective new tenant when the space is actually going to be available. And in fact, just yesterday, I toured space with a client and we walked through this space and we're looking at a March 1st commencement date for this other tenant for our client. Well, this building was still occupied by an ongoing company with lots of big machinery in it, big warehouse. And we're looking around and saying, when are you moving? Our lease expires October 30th, 31st.
Of this year.
And gosh. I'm like, all right, so that means you got 2.5 months to move all of this stuff, this big, heavy equipment that you're currently using. I mean, they have a paint booth and I mean, on and on and on. And we're just looking around like, I'm not sure I believe this is really going to be out of the way. So that creates a problem for our client if they sign the lease, because now they don't really have high confidence that that tenant's going to move out of the way. Improvements can be done that they need, and then they move in on time. And, in their case, it's not an expiration date issue. It's a cycle of business issue where they're really, really busy. Slam season kicks in April. So if they don't move in March, they've got a big problem.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. This one is more applicable since seems like the industrial side of the equation is going more than office of late. What is a phase 1 study?
Phase 1 environmental study. So basically a phase 1 is that, there's a lot of companies out there that are, consulting companies, engineering companies, environmental engineering companies. And what they will do is they will help a prospective buyer of a property or developer of a property or lender on a property make sure that there's no contamination from some environmental contamination from the past. So if you have a property that was once used as a coal gasification plant, which is actually a real thing in Austin, many, many, many years ago, there was a building built in mid 80s. And when they started digging into the ground to, set the piers and foundation, the walls of that pit now were seeping oil, something that looked like oil, and it was a coal gasification plant. So they were taking coal and kind of turning it into a gas of some sort to light all the lamps, the gas lamps that were up and down Congress Avenue and throughout the city. Well, that was the site of the plant where they were doing that. So they had to dig up all that dirt, remediate it, meaning clean it up. And so that property forever will, every time it sells, somebody's going to say, hey, did y'all really clean all that up? Is that really all gone? Because nobody wants to be in the title chain of an environmentally contaminated property. Because my understanding is that once you're in the title chain, you can never be relieved of your liability for that. And so that's why lenders never want the risk of being in the title chain. So if they're going to lend on a building that has that kind of stuff, there's a chance they might someday foreclose on it if the borrower defaults,
doesn't perform,
and they don't want to have that risk. So they may not be willing to loan on the building because of that. So usually the phase one environmental study is dictated by the lender. The lender is going to require you to do that. And it's going to be some engineering firm that comes in, and what they're going to do is they're going to like walk around the property, look at things, see if there's anything that tips them off that there might have been a problem. They may do a title search to see if anything in the back, in the history shows that property was used for something that would likely have had an opportunity to contaminate the property. Most of the time in the deals that I've been involved with, it comes out clean and we don't have to worry about it. But if there's a suspicion, then you go to the phase two, and then there could even be a phase three. It just becomes more invasive as the number goes up. But that's really all it is, trying to determine whether or not there's a
environmental hazard
probability of that anyway.
Okay, last but certainly not least, and probably your favorite.
Oh no.
Renewal option.
Get one, never use it. Next.
Well, it's our tagline. Don't renew,
renegotiate.
There you go.
Yeah. So in fact, on our website, there's a whole page dedicated to this in my book, also called Confessions of a Recovering Landlord. There's a whole chapter dedicated to this. So, the short version is you should always get a renewal option because it acts as a reservation for your space. You don't want the landlord to have the opportunity at the end of your lease term to go lease it out to someone else. You want to have the first shot at the space. So you get a renewal option for that purpose. The problem is the only thing that typically changes in a renewal option is the expiration date gets pushed back 5 years, 10 years, whatever, the length of renewal that you've negotiated, and it changes the lease rate or the rental rate. Usually that's the only two things. Now, you could negotiate for it to be different. You could negotiate for a new base year if you have a base year lease. You could negotiate for a refurbishment allowance if you want some improvement money. You could negotiate for some free rent, although good luck with that. So there are things that could happen that you could negotiate for. But even if you do that, I still don't recommend you ever exercise a renewal option, because who knows what the market conditions are going to be 5 years from now, much less 10. So 5 years from now, when we're now, looking at and really 4 years from now, because you don't want to wait till the end of the year, into the lease term, usually a renewal option requires that the tenant give landlord notice some period of time in advance. Could be as short as 3 months. Usually it's going to be 6, 9, or 12 months out. So now a year before your lease expires, you got to tell the landlord whether or not you're exercising that option. So we recommend that we start even earlier and say 3 to 6 months prior to the expiration. 3 to 6 months prior to the date by which you have to give notice for your exercise of the renewal option. We want to be talking about what the tenant's goals and objectives are, and whether or not staying in the building makes sense, or should they be buying a building? Should they be moving? Should they be expanding, open up a new location? Whatever the need is, we need to be talking about that long before that renewal option exercise date comes along. If it's a really hot market for the landlord and there is really, really low vacancy, so we don't have a lot of other options, we may be put in a position, if we can't get something negotiated in time, where we have to exercise that option. That's why we want to start early. But we really don't want to be put in that position. We want to put the landlord in the position where they have to compete to keep us. So we go to the landlord and start negotiating with them where everything's on the table. So now we're saying we're not just changing the expiration date. And by the way, we don't want that 5-year deal that was in the renewal option. We want a 7-year deal, a 4-year deal, whatever makes sense for the client. And by the way, we want a new base year if that's the way the lease is structured. We want some free rent. We want some money for improvements. We want another renewal option. We might want a termination option, an expansion option, and an option to buy the building. I mean, there might be all kinds of stuff that we might want. We want to get rid of that guarantee you made us give you the first time around. There's a lot of things that may be in the lease that we don't want. We see this a lot on leases that we didn't negotiate, where we now are representing the client and we're inheriting a lease that they signed when they used another agent or no agent at all. And so that's where we're trying to get a lot of things that's already in the lease besides just the economic stuff. So suffice it to say that, we always want to get the renewal option as a reservation, but we don't want to use it because it doesn't necessarily represent what the market conditions are at the time that would actually come into play. And it doesn't cover enough things that we want to renegotiate.
Right. Well, thank you for answering all our burning questions today. And hey, if the masses want more of this, we've got a ton more glossary terms we can go through. So if we have just ever so many requests below our YouTube channel, they're asking, please, please more. I may have to dial you up and ask you more questions.
All right. So you get back to me on that one.
Y'all have a good week.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening. And just a reminder to send in questions to see if we can stump Bob.
Not going to happen.
We really appreciate your taking the time to tune into this episode. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star rating on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And if you are on our YouTube channel, we would love to read your feedback in the comment section. Also, be sure to subscribe so you get notified when we publish new episodes. Thanks, and see you next time.
Bye.